It is just before midnight, a quiet street on the edge of a ruined German city. A man steps out of his own front door into the cold March dark. There are figures waiting for him. They say they are German pilots, shot down, lost, trying to reach their own lines. The man is the mayor. He tells them the war is almost over. He tells them to give themselves up. And then one of them straightens, raises a pistol, and shouts 2 words. Heil Hitler. A single shot. The first free mayor of Aachen is dead on his own steps, murdered, not by the enemy he had surrendered to, but by his own countrymen. This is the story of Operation Carnival, the one assassination a dying regime carried out against one of its own citizens in the final weeks of the Second World War. It is a story of a captured American bomber, of an SS death squad that included a 16-year-old boy and a young woman who knew the ground. But it is also the story of a lie, because the killers belonged to something called the Werewolf, a secret army Germany boasted would rise from the ashes and fight forever. That army was almost entirely a fiction, and yet the fear of it would help kill thousands. This is where the myth and the murder meet. To understand why this man had to die, you have to understand the city he governed. Aachen, on the western edge of Germany, hard against the Belgian and Dutch frontier. This was no ordinary town. It was old beyond reckoning, said to be the birthplace of Charlemagne. 32 German kings had been crowned within its walls. For the Third Reich, Aachen was sacred ground, a symbol of a 1,000-year empire that Hitler had promised would last another 1,000 years. So when the Americans came for it, Hitler gave a simple order: hold it, at any cost. The cost was terrible. From the 2nd of October, 1944, the American First Army ground into the city, house by house, cellar by cellar, street by ruined street. For nearly 3 weeks, the fighting tore through the old stone heart of Aachen, and on the 21st of October, it was over. Aachen became the first major German city to fall to the Allies, but the city that surrendered was a corpse of itself. A pre-war population of more than 160,000 had drained away to barely 10,000 souls, living in the rubble, among the broken walls, beneath a cathedral that had stood for 1,000 years. The Americans now held a German city, and they needed a German to run it, not a Nazi, someone the people could trust. Through the Bishop of Aachen, they found him. His name was Franz Oppenhoff, a lawyer, 42 years old, a devout Catholic, a husband and a father. He was an expert in the regime's own laws, and he had quietly used that knowledge against it, defending Jewish-owned firms, serving the church the Nazis despised. He had no love for Hitler, and Hitler's men had no love for him. On the 31st of October, 1944, Franz Oppenhoff accepted the post that would kill him. He became the Lord Mayor of Aachen, the first free German mayor of the post-Nazi age. To the men still ruling what was left of the Reich, this was not administration. It was treason. A German on the most sacred German soil, governing for the enemy. The propaganda machine branded such men traitors of the worst kind, and the leadership took it personally. From the very top of the SS, an order began to take shape. Franz Oppenhoff would be made an example. He would be killed in his own home by Germans, as a warning to every other German who might dare to cooperate. The order had a code name. They called it Carnival. The men who would carry out the killing belonged to something new and strange, the Werewolf. In the autumn of 1944, with the Reich collapsing inward from east and west, Heinrich Himmler ordered a stay-behind force created, an elite of fanatics who would hide as the front rolled over them, then strike at the enemy's rear. Sabotage, ambush, assassination. He handed the task to an SS general named Hans-Adolf, who set up training schools in castles behind the lines. On paper, it was meant to be a small, disciplined commando force. What it became, in the public imagination, was something else entirely, because then Joseph Goebbels got hold of the name. The Reich's master of propaganda saw in the word werewolf something irresistible, a weapon made of fear. In the spring of 1945, he launched a radio station, Radio Werewolf. Its broadcasts opened with the long, rising howl of a wolf, and night after night it told the world that a vast, secret army of fanatical partisans was waiting in the shadows, that no occupier would ever be safe, that Germans would fight on forever, alone in the dark, with knife and poison and wire. It was electrifying, it was terrifying, and it was, very largely, a lie. Here is the truth historians would later untangle. Radio Werewolf had almost nothing to do with the actual military unit. Goebbels' broadcasts were propaganda theater, what one historian called pure ideological nihilism, disconnected from the small, real force Prutzmann was building. The genuine werewolf was never the nationwide insurgency the airwaves promised. Most of the attacks later blamed on werewolves were carried out by ordinary German soldiers, or were exaggerated, or never happened at all. The Army of the Night was, for the most part, a sound effect, a howl on the radio. But out of that smoke, one real operation was about to step into the light. The team chosen for Carnival numbered 6. At its head, an SS lieutenant named Herbert Wenzel, an instructor from the Werewolf Training School. Beside him, an Austrian sergeant, Josef Leitgeb, Sepp Leitgeb, another instructor, and a hard man. Then 2 border patrolmen who knew the frontier. And then the 2 who would make this story unforgettable. A 16-year-old boy of the Hitler Youth named Erich Morgenschweiss, a child sent to murder, and a 22-year-old woman, Ilse Hirsch, a leader in the League of German Girls, the female wing of the Hitler Youth. She was local. She knew the lanes and the woods around Aachen. She would be their guide to the mayor's door. If you made it this far, you're one of us. Hit subscribe and like. We unbury history every week. Now, back to our story. Ilse Hirsch is the figure who haunts this story. Born in 1922, she had joined the League of German Girls at 16 and risen to lead it. She was not a soldier dragged into war. She was a true believer, formed entirely by the regime, who volunteered to guide killers to the home of a man whose only crime was trying to govern a broken city with decency. There is no battlefield here, no fog of combat, just a young woman walking familiar roads, in the dark, leading death to a particular front door. Remember her, because the war will give her an ending almost no one expects. On the 20th of March, 1945, the operation began with an act of deception, worthy of the propaganda that spawned it. The team boarded an American B-17 bomber, a flying fortress the Germans had captured and pressed into service. The enemy's own aircraft, wearing the wrong colors, carrying killers toward a German city. It crossed the lines in the dark, and the 6 dropped by parachute into the woods near the frontier, in the borderland where Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany meet. They came down among wet pines, in the cold, miles from their target. And almost at once, the mission claimed its first life. At the frontier, they encountered a young man doing his duty, a 20-year-old Dutch border guard named Josef Seive. He was not a target. He was not part of any plan. He was simply in the way. And so they killed him. An ordinary man, 20 years old, the first to die for Operation Carnival. His name now a footnote to a murder that wasn't even his. Then the team moved on, the 2 locals leading, through ground they knew by heart, toward the edge of Aachen and the home of Franz Oppenhoff. The night of the 24th of March, Franz Oppenhoff was at a gathering with neighbors. He was fetched home. There were men outside, German pilots, they said, shot down and desperate to reach their own lines. Oppenhoff went out to them. He was a reasonable man, and the war was clearly lost. He spoke to them gently. He told them it was nearly over. He urged them to surrender, to save themselves. He was still trying to save their lives when Sepp Leitgeb drew his pistol, threw out his arm, and shouted, "Heil Hitler!" The shot struck Oppenhoff in the head. The mayor of Aachen fell dead on the steps of his own home in the first hours of the 25th of March, 1945. The killers ran, back into the dark fields, toward the lines, toward escape. And here the war wrote an ending no scriptwriter would dare. Somewhere in that black, mined borderland, Ilse Hirsch, the guide, the one who knew the ground, caught a wire, or stepped where she should not have stepped. A landmine erupted out of the earth. The blast threw her down and tore her badly, and it killed the man beside her, Josef Leitgeb, the triggerman, the one who had shouted Heil Hitler and murdered an unarmed mayor minutes before. The hunters had become the hunted, undone not by an enemy, but by the very war they served. Franz Oppenhoff was 42 years old. He left a widow and children. He had governed a dead city for less than 5 months, asking only to bring a little order to the ruins, and for that, his own nation had sent a death squad to his door. His murder changed nothing. The front did not move. The war did not last. Just 6 weeks after he fell, Germany surrendered. The mayor of Aachen had been killed for a cause that was already finished, by a regime with days left to live. Justice, when it came strangely. In 1949, the surviving members of the team stood trial in Aachen, the Werewolf trial. Some were convicted and sentenced to between 1 and 4 years in prison. The commander, Wenzel, was never tried at all. He had vanished into the chaos of the war's last days, his fate unknown to this day. And Ilse Hirsch, the woman who had led the killers to the door, admitted her part in the attack and was acquitted. She walked free. She lived a long, ordinary, quiet life. She did not die until the year 2000. The guide to a murder grew old in peace, while the man she guided them to had been dead for 55 years. And what of the werewolf, the army of the night that Radio Werewolf had promised? It never came. By the summer of 1945, Allied intelligence had concluded that the network, as a real fighting force, was already destroyed, that it had never truly existed in the form the broadcast described. The wolves were mostly smoke. But here is the terrible thing. The fear was not. Convinced that fanatics lurked in every village, occupying armies struck back hard. Historians estimate that the werewolf, its handful of real actions and the reprisals its myth provoked, cost somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 lives. In the West, as many as 100,000 German civilians were swept into camps on suspicion. In the Soviet zone, perhaps 10,000 young men were arrested as werewolves. Around half never came home. A phantom army, conjured on the radio, got thousands of real people killed. We tell stories of the resistance, of the ordinary people who defied tyranny and paid for it. Operation Carnival is the dark mirror of those stories. Here, the regime murdered one of its own citizens, precisely because he chose decency over the dying Reich. It used children to do it. A 16-year-old boy, a young woman barely out of girlhood, turning the regime's own youth into its final assassins. Franz Oppenhoff did nothing but try to govern a broken city humanely. And that, to the men in the bunkers, was the unforgivable crime. But the deepest lesson of Operation Carnival isn't the murder. It's the myth. The werewolf was, above all, a story. A story Goebbels told because his guns had failed, and a story was all he had left. And that story did more damage than the organization ever could. It got an innocent border guard killed in the woods. It got a good man shot on his doorstep. And then, long after the Reich was ash, it got thousands more killed. Not by werewolves, but by the fear of them. That is the warning Operation Carnival leaves us. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon a dying power has is a lie frightening enough to make its enemies do its killing for it. Franz Oppenhoff, the first free mayor of Aachen, killed by his own country 6 weeks before it surrendered, for the crime of trying to do good among the ruins. Remember the man, and remember the howl on the radio, and how a lie, well told, can be deadlier than any wolf. If this story moved you, stay with us. There are more of them, the ones history almost forgot.